probably one of the most widely published authors in the data space out there, as well as author of more than 300 specific scholarly articles that help everybody else beyond this specific community get other parts, understand more about what's happening here. And that is our job as academics, is to push this knowledge out there so that everybody else can build on it. Tom has been a supporter of this event for a long time and has absolutely a stellar reputation. If you haven't read his book, Competing on Analytics, you probably should. It's kind of required reading at this point. Wouldn't you agree, Tom?
Other people read some of my other books at this point, but whatever.
You'll tell us about some of them, too. Well, Tom's going to talk this morning about what AI can do for data, and it probably has a little to do with garbage in and garbage out. Tom, thanks for coming here.
Thanks for having me. Thanks, Peter. I gather this counts as a good turnout in this room, so I'm pleased with that, and we have 150 or more online. So welcome to all of you. Three very momentary digressions. One, I don't know if any of you looked at the panel or the pictures, but this is the Doc Edgerton room. He's the MIT professor who very famously, I'm sure you've seen the photograph of the bullet going through the apple. He was the pioneer of kind of strobe photography. He did a lot of other things at MIT as well, but that's what he's known for. Two, this is the panel, this is the track known as Innovative Academic Research Knowledge Fit for Use, but I was talking with Peter and John about this morning. There aren't very many academics around. Maybe their knowledge isn't fit for use, most of them, I don't know. But Peter's is and mine is and John's is, but I'd like to encourage any of you who are academics to get involved in this. Nothing could be more important than improving the world of data. And those of you who are in businesses, you can say, we'll support academic research and activity and training and so on in academic institutions. And thirdly, with Rich Wang and the CDOIQ, I am doing a study of chief data officers sponsored by Amazon Web Services. You'll hear about it, I think, after the conference ends. There are two pieces to it. There's a qualitative set of interviews of chief data officers and chief data and analytics officers. So if you are one of those and would like to be interviewed, just let me know, and would love to do that. We're probably going to do 20 to 40, I would say. Rich is going to do some as well. And then we hope to have hundreds, if not thousands, of quantitative survey responses. So that's what will really be going out after the conference. So I think we need to know a lot more about this job and what makes its incumbents successful. And this study, I hope, will do that. Every year, I work with Randy Bean and New Vantage Partners on a survey that is about 90% chief data and analytics officers, but there are some people who sneak in who are not in that role, and B, we only get about 75 or 80 respondents typically, so we'd like to increase the numbers dramatically. So that's it for digressions. This talk is a new talk. I've never done it before, so I generally don't like it when you have these intrusions with all the videos and the announcements and so on, but today I'm fine with it because I have no idea how long this talk is going to last. Please raise questions at any time during it, and Peter and John will relay online questions to me. This topic, I decided, I generally am oriented to what you do with data more than data management, but it occurred to me that as I was doing work on AI, there are an awful lot of data-related activities that one can pursue with AI. And I think thus far they've been quite sort of scattered, and we haven't had a kind of an overall view. So this is the first attempt I know of at an overall view of what AI can do for data. There was I believe I remember a Gartner pronouncement that using AI to make data better would become more important. 70% chance of this by 2026, of course, in the usual fashion based on no data whatsoever. I'm just kind of pulling a projection out of the air. But I think, and I hope that they're right about that. So I'm going to go through some bright spots, 3 or 4 of them for AI in data already, and talk about what AI can't really do very well yet. I collaborated on this with a guy named Tom Redman. Maybe some of you know him. He sometimes goes by the data doctor. He's been a data quality expert for several decades now. He did data quality work at Bell Labs. And still goes around and I think produces some of the most useful tools. He has a Friday afternoon data quality check, and lest you think you don't really want to give up your Friday afternoons to checking data quality, it only takes about 15 or 30 minutes to go through this. So I think it is one of the handiest and easiest to apply tools in that space. But he couldn't be here today, so he bears no responsibility for anything I say. Okay, so why does data need AI? I think I'm probably preaching to the converted on this topic, but data management activities have always been very labor intensive, and that was okay when we didn't have that much data. But as data proliferates, clearly we're generating it at a faster rate than I think we're generating new human beings, certainly than we're generating new human beings who are going to be working with data. And already we're substantially outnumbered. There's a lot more data around than there are people to manage it, improve it, et cetera. We still have a lot of data quality problems. I don't think that we have fundamentally improved data quality overall. I mean, it's like a Gartner assertion, an assertion, I should say 70% probability that we haven't improved data quality much over the years, and that leads to high levels of cost and low levels of trust in data. I have always thought that these sort of top-down approaches to data management, enterprise-wide master data management, or if you go back as far as I do to information engineering, which was something that happened earlier in my career. The Pentagon got very excited about it, lots and lots of money spent on it. Some of you may remember this guy, Paul Strassman, who was the first chief information officer at the DoD, who tried to engineer all of the information. It generally did not work. If you're a US taxpayer, you should feel like you got gypped a bit, because that was a largely unsuccessful activity, and it was in many of the companies that I saw as well. So I think we need some better approaches to this, and AI, which tends to be a more bottom-up kind of counting things, seeing what's going on, I think holds a lot more promise. It's probably fair to say that most businesses don't really want to spend a lot of money on data management, so we need to lower the cost as well. One of the conclusions, I've already interviewed about 12 chief data officers, and one of the conclusions that I've come to is you don't really want to be a chief data officer. You want to be a chief data and analytics officer, because it's too damn hard to show value if you're just a chief data officer. Analytics and AI, great. We can show lots of value with those, but data management is really quite difficult. I won't quote him. Someone who was at this conference said to me yesterday, yeah, I would never take a chief data officer job. That's a 2-year job. People rarely last beyond 2 years because they're brought in with great hopes that they can straighten out all the data, and they can't because it's pretty much impossible, and so they're gone. Fortunately, there's a good market for CDOs, so you can find another place to go and spend another 2 years. But smart CDOs will say, no, give me analytics, or I'm not taking that job. And of course, as I say, I'm mostly oriented to what you do with data, which means analytics and AI. And we need a lot more data. AI, of course, runs on data, at least machine learning does, and we don't have enough data, and we don't have enough data engineers to make good data for AI. So I hope that all of that is enough to make you think, yeah, more and better AI would be very useful in this space. Now, I sort of made this process chart up for the tasks that could be supported by AI and data management. I don't know of any sort of definitive one, but it starts with deciding what data we need, and then we have to capture the data, and we have to assess what the existing quality is, and maybe we extract it from the form in which it currently resides. I'll talk more about that later. If we're going to use it for supervised learning or to make it easily available to the people who want to use it, we have to tag it or label it or something like that. We have to create a catalog so people can ultimately find it. We, in this field, have found that data needs to be integrated, and 2 versions or 22 versions of the same data need to be mastered so that we can find a golden record, if you will. It's interesting. I wonder if that master term in the data space, which seems to be proliferating now, will ultimately go away, because if you look for a house recently, nobody calls it the master bedroom anymore. It's the primary bedroom. So maybe we'll call it the primarying or something like that instead of mastering. And then, of course, we have to analyze the data, and I think that's where we've made the most progress with regard to AI. So I won't really talk about it all that much, but there are a number of ways in which AI is, or at least automation capabilities, are helping us analyze data. I'm quite excited about automated machine learning that can allow citizen data scientists to produce pretty high quality models. MLOps allows us to see in an automated way, has that model drifted and does it need to be retrained? There are tools, I'm not sure there is a well-received name for them, but there are data discovery tools that are semi-automated that will say, no need for you to do correlations in your data. Here's the interesting things in your data. And I think you can probably not rely exclusively on those tools to find all the interesting things in your data, but you can certainly get some help in that regard. We've had a very painful process, I think, for humans to make sense of data. You're supposed to sort of gaze at it for hours. Maybe if you were like my friend Tom Redman out of Bell Labs, you do a sort of a exploratory data analysis like John Tukey used to do, where you see what the ranges were and what the outliers were and so on. And then you're supposed to do some bar charts, or never pie charts, only bar charts, to try to see what the distribution is. It's a very painful process that you have to go through even before you start to do any sort of associations in the data. So lots of things we can automate, and there are, these are less tasks than sort of attributes, but things like lineage and I guess ETL and ELT. I'm still not quite sure why ETL is changing to ELT, but I don't really care all that much. We have to, as part of labeling, I guess, attach metadata. We have to manage privacy along the way. So lots of other things to think about that AI might be able to help with. Okay, so let me get to the positive story here. I think there are some bright spots. One of them is data extraction. I think AI is generally quite good. Tom Redmond made me add, at least compared to humans, he doesn't think AI is that good, but he does agree it's better than humans, at extracting important data out of difficult formats. So I was actually thinking about this recently. I have written a new book with John Glasser. Some of you, if you're from the Boston area, he was the first chief information officer of what's now called Mass General Brigham, very smart fellow, on AI in healthcare, and we talk about the problem of faxes in healthcare. And I think, was it you who here last night was saying that you had seen the elimination of faxes from the intelligence community, basically, more or less, and yeah, and I said, well, you're well ahead of healthcare because they're not eliminated at all there, at least in the United States. I am told that in other countries, faxes have largely disappeared from the healthcare scene, but not in the United States. God knows why. I have no clue. However, it is possible to use AI to extract the most important information out of a fax. And you say, well, why don't you just give up the faxes in the first place, which I would wholeheartedly agree with. But if you're a company that is trying to just deal with the information in them, there is a company in the Boston area that created an AI program to extract data from medical records. Jonathan Bush, who I think was the cousin of George Bush, was the CEO, and he wrote a little article in Harvard Business Review about what great results they have had about, I think he called it taking the scut work out of healthcare by extracting data with AI from faxes. And I think he said we saved 22 cents per fax or something as compared to having humans look at it. I thought about this yesterday with regard to PDFs. Now, I'm sure there was a great reason to create PDFs. I guess it was mostly so you could ensure the correct formatting of the data and to make it difficult for people to edit it. Now, the only thing that's difficult about it is you have to buy Adobe Acrobat to edit it. But so I changed my state of residence recently from Florida to Massachusetts again. And my lawyer in Florida had done all these wills and estate plans and so on and sent them up as PDFs. And I thought, wouldn't it be a much better world if AI could extract the data, or even better, if it never went into a PDF in the first place. There are lots and lots of tools now that will extract data from things like PDFs and so on. Companies do a lot of work extracting data from contracts of various types. Deloitte does this a lot on the audit side, I think. Carl, I don't know if you ever worked with Kira. I don't know if we're still using Kira. I'm a senior advisor to Deloitte, not a real employee, but very common to do now, works pretty well. We've been doing this with optical character recognition for a long time with handwriting. We don't even call it AI anymore. It's so common now. But my feeling is, it's too bad that we put this data in these strange formats in the first place. And so a friend of mine named Shelby Austin, she's former head of AI for Deloitte Canada, left Deloitte, took some IP with Deloitte's permission, I guess. Maybe there were some contractual arrangements there. Created a company called Arteria AI. I wrote a little piece about it in Forbes recently. And what they do is to create structured contractual data in financial contracts in the first place, using a workflow engine, a little bit of AI to say, okay, instead of creating a contract that ends up being a template for other people's contracts, you end up with maybe 12 different versions of the same contract that people have to look through and decide which one makes the most sense the next time I'm creating a contract. They use AI and workflow to preserve the key elements of the contract. They can, of course, write out a contract from those key elements, but it's the key elements that count. And if you think about it, if you have those key elements that are separate from the contract, then you can start to do things with analytics. You can say to Goldman Sachs was the company that I interviewed about this, and they're making substantial progress, although they're not there yet at spreading this throughout their financial contracts process. As you can imagine, they do a lot of them. But if I'm a Goldman Sachs lawyer and I'm going to create a contract, I start to make it up and say, okay, I want to use, maybe you choose from a list, this provision, this provision, this provision. And AI would be able to tell you, excuse me, but the last 10 contracts that had those same provisions have been rejected by the counterparty. So you might want to reconsider. Or something like, we have tended to find that Goldman experiences less risk when you include this particular provision. So that, I think, would be really what we might start to call smart contracts. So I think we're making progress here. Smart contracts and extracting or never putting data into these crazy formats in the first place is sort of the future, but pretty common to do it out of things like faxes and PDFs and so on. It seems quite pedestrian, but Anthem, the big healthcare company, was one of the companies that I talked to about this, and they said, yeah, we had a case where we had PDFs that had our customer, or I think they call that member, plan information in it. So somebody calls the helpline saying, the call center saying, I need to know whether, I can get a CAT scan for this problem. Will that be covered? Well, right now the call center has to read through a PDF, very time consuming. So they're trying to extract all of that data so the call center people can find it more quickly. And as you can imagine, that would ultimately allow you to have a smarter interface with a customer than a call center agent reading it. Maybe eventually you don't have to have the call center at all. So lots of possibilities for improving business this way, I think. You don't have to go very far. Go into the other building, and you'll see several companies that do data mastering, as I said, that antiquated, maybe soon to change term. This, I believe, is a big step forward over the whole master data management process as we've done it in the past, largely rule-based. I suppose you could argue that was AI at one point, but machine learning tends to do it a lot better, particularly as you proliferate rules, it starts to get quite brittle. Machine learning relies on probabilistic matching. John Smith, customer of ours at 123 Main Street in Albany, probably the same person as John Smythe at 123 Main Street in Albany. 95% probability, you've decided, we'll put them together. If there's any doubt about it, if you're doing that matching, the smart companies, and the one that I work with most closely, I'm an advisor to them, is Tamer. They certainly do it this way. They send it to a subject matter expert and say, the system only calculated a 67% probability that this is the same person. What do you think? And they have been able to do this with a number of companies that had a nice dinner last night, and companies were talking about it. They've had some presentations. There are certainly other companies that do this, and I don't want to only push that Tamer does it, but it works quite well. Now these companies are starting to not only match data, but also to enrich it and say we have some other sources of data. Tamer, for example, has done a partnership with Dun & Bradstreet where they will enrich your data, add more information than was initially in there, again, using AI. And I think it's really smart to say there's still a human role here. AI can take you, maybe 80, 90% of the way, and you automatically send it to a subject matter expert who can take it the rest of the way. Okay, so that's bright spot number 2. Number 3 is in data quality assessment. And Tom Redman insists that I say not data quality improvement necessarily, but knowing that you have a problem, yes, AI can help with that. So it can tell you whether data values are in the range that they should be or in the correct format. Also good at identifying duplicate records. We were talking last night about all the duplicate records that are in the attendee list for this conference. So I don't know if you've noticed that and reflected on the irony of it, but maybe at some point we'll dedupe all of these. I was telling Peter that I was having a few problems with version control for my talk this morning, so clearly I'm not that good at it personally either. But it would be not surprising for even this morning for my operating system to tell me, by the way, you have a newer version of this same file that you're looking at. Are you sure you don't want to look at that one? But it didn't do that. This data quality work mostly now uses business rules. Again, that used to be considered the best AI technology that we had. I think at some point it'll probably shift to machine learning. But all it really does is to identify problems. It's not terribly good at fixing them, except for things like, who knew, the United States Postal Service saying, oh, by the way, do you mean this address? And there more and more you see this sort of thing. Excuse me, that phone number doesn't exist, or it's not in the right format, or it's not in the format that we want you to put it in anyway, date of birth, et cetera. So I think we're making some progress, not a whole lot of intelligence involved in this if you're only using rules, but I suspect it will get better over time. One more, a lot of companies are doing catalog creation, not the Sears Roebuck catalog, but data catalogs. And I think one of the great secular trends in data management is more and more now we're focusing not just on capture and storage of data, but on consumption, which, by the way, why were we gathering data in the first place if it wasn't going to be consumed? But many IT people focused on those early steps in the data supply chain, not on consumption. Now we realize, gee, it would be really nice if people could actually find that data. And it turns out that catalog creation is a fairly common activity. My friends at Tamer told me, yeah, you can create a catalog pretty easily, but it usually points out how bad your data is. And Andy Palmer, who's the CEO of Tamer, an old friend of mine, said, one of the biggest impediments to their business is that people using their tools for mastering find out just how incredibly lousy their data is. And they're so depressed they don't want to do anything about it, or it becomes a political issue, and people say, I'm not going to acknowledge that my data is that lousy by hiring somebody to fix it. So ideally, we'd want to create catalogs of clean and curated data, not just the existing mess that's there. We don't want to have the perfect be the enemy of the good. A catalog of bad data is better than no catalog at all. But more and more companies, I think, are saying, okay, we'll do the mastering, but also we'll do the cataloging after the mastering is done. So you'll have a catalog of all those, clean, golden records. And cataloging is often combined, I think Scott and I were talking about it this morning, combined with metadata management, some assessment of the quality, some of the lineage information, which is just starting to be addressed by AI, governance facilitation, which I think you said was one of the things that your platform does, Scott. So some of these companies are also using more semantic tools, a knowledge graph to show the relationships among the data, but for the most part, I think it's just lists. And of course, the goal is better information consumption along the way. This is an emerging bright spot in data privacy and security. We can use AI to predict who might be using data fraudulently, not just customers or people outside your organization, but there are companies that will predict that someone is likely to be committing fraud inside your company. Be careful, by the way, if you're in a financial services firm and you send an email with the word tickets in it, I'm told, because that will raise a flag that you're maybe giving somebody free tickets in exchange for some business favor. There are probably other words, but I was told don't use the word tickets. AI can predict who might be a threat to your data. I wrote a little piece about it was FireEye, then it became Mandiant, then it became Google, I think, that was identifying whether a threat was from an existing group of evildoers, hackers, or a new group somehow, and using machine learning to figure that out. Some other companies use AI to identify attack paths through your data. AI can triage security incidents. One of the big problems with AI in cybersecurity is way too many false positives, which generates a lot of work on behalf of the cyber people to try to, figure out what they need to address and what they don't. And AI can help with that regard and say, this one is a serious problem, you need to address that. AI can tell you if your data ended up where it shouldn't be, i.e. specifically on the dark web. There's a company in the Boston area called Recorded Future that does a lot of that work that I do some work with. And they use some combination of supervised learning, and I was surprised how much of the cyber stuff is unsupervised learning to kind of identify anomalies in your data privacy and security. Okay, so that's the end of the bright spots. Now for the depressing stuff, what AI can't do. Well, I think it's really important to be realistic about this. So if you're a chief data officer, you're unlikely to be replaced by AI because you may be replaced by your company, but you won't be replaced by AI because AI can't create a data strategy or say what data is really important to your business or anything like that. Theoretically, at some point in the future, it could say, other companies like you are very interested in employee attrition. Maybe you should be too, but I don't think there's anything like that now. One of the big challenges that many organizations have with data is kind of a data-driven culture, and AI can't create that for you. AI can't put the data management roles in place that you need if you're going to be successful with data management. AI can't really, unless you have a pattern to draw from, AI can't really calibrate sensors or equipment. One of the big problems that we have with the Internet of Things is we have lots and lots of false data coming in from sensors in many cases, and people spend a huge amount of time saying, I don't think that is working effectively. No data governance policies and structures can be created by AI. Can't define terms or put a common language in place within your business. This is a topic that's been of great interest to me for, I don't know, a couple of decades now. I once formulated what I call Davenport's Law of Common Information. You're all familiar with it, I'm sure, right? Why the laughter? I don't get it. Davenport's Law, in case by some chance you're not familiar, says the more an organization knows or cares about a particular business entity, the less likely it is to agree on a common term and meaning for it. So I first observed this I was doing some research work at American Airlines, and they said, yeah, you know, we've got 11 different meanings of the term airport around here. And I thought, first, that's scary because I'm a, you know, platinum flyer. They might take me to the wrong place, but it made sense. I said, you know, the cargo people think any place you can drop off or pick up cargo is an airport. Maintenance people think any place you can fix an airplane is an airport. The International Standards Body has a list of airports. Some people think that's the ultimate list. I thought, wow, that's, you know, it's an oddity. Shortly thereafter, I went to Union Pacific Railroad, and they said, oh, we have great debates about what's a train around here. And then I did some work with the US Department of Justice, and they said, could you help us agree on what is a trial? So I concluded that the more an organization knows or cares about an entity, the less likely it is to agree, which the corollary of this, if you're disagreeing a lot about the meaning of something, it means you care about it. So the good news is, if you have big debates in your company about what's a customer, that means people really care about what's a customer. However, AI can't solve that problem for you. It's not data architecture, it's not data automation, it's data arguing among your senior executives to say, yeah, you know, I understand why that particular definition of revenue, or I used to work some with digital equipment, they got in big trouble because they couldn't agree on what constituted a sale in that company. There were indirect sales and direct sales, and they were always at war with each other about when you recognize a sale. But you need to have that discussion. It's just not going to be facilitated much by AI. AI can't tell you if you're using the wrong data to solve your problem. Even if you have automated machine learning, you still have to point it at a data set and say, you know, look at every feature or variable in this data set to see what predicts this outcome, but you still have to tell it where to look. It can't tell you where you should store or process your data. I was doing a little bit of work with IBM, and they had a customer who said, we're working on a system that would tell us, okay, this is an Italian business that does a lot of computer storage and processing for the Italian government, tax returns and things like that. And they said, we've got all these legacy systems. Every time we try to figure out where a piece of data should be stored, we think, well, you know, who's going to be using it and so on. They think they will eventually have a rules-based system that will tell them this would work better in the cloud, or this should be on-premise, or whatever, but not yet. And you know, if AI tells you, for example, that somebody is mucking around with your data in a way that they shouldn't be, it can't arrest anybody. It can't charge them with a crime. You have to investigate. So again, I think this is, I guess, good news for humans. So far, only humans can arrest and prosecute other humans. Now, that may change, but for the most part, we're in good shape there. We also have a quite confusing vendor landscape about this. So in general, there are a few classes of AI for data vendors. They're big companies with a broad top-down approach, pretty service intensive. So Palantir comes to mind. I'll say some more about them in a second. Kind of mysterious, and purportedly a product-oriented company, but they have been revealed to be very services-oriented. Accenture, of course, I used to work there. It's a very services-oriented company. I found out last night at the Women in Data event sponsored by Deloitte that Deloitte, I should have put Deloitte on this list too, because it's starting to do that broad approach, not necessarily with one set of tools, but at least to assemble how you put it together. I was mostly talking about software-oriented companies here, but then you have this other category of bigger to mid-sized companies with a middle-level approach and product-intensive. So a lot of different products. You go to Informatica, they'll say, yeah, we do a lot of things with AI to manage different aspects of this process. Not fully integrated yet. You're going to need a lot of services to put it all together, but multiple tools. You have big cloud companies. As I said, AWS is sponsoring my Chief Data Officer research. I don't want to insult them, but they have 250 different offerings, many of which use AI. It's hard to find an AWS employee who knows what those 250 different offerings are. Lots of little pieces that you'd have to assemble. Then there are middle-sized companies that have high valuations, the Snowflakes of the world, developing broader data science, storage, and management platforms. Not yet much of a focus, maybe at Calibra, certainly not at Snowflake or Databricks on the data management task, but maybe a little bit on data quality related issues and so on. And then smaller companies with a more narrow bottom-up approach. I put Tamer in this category. Great job of data mastering and now some enriching, but the other things they don't really focus on. There are many other companies. So making sense of this is quite challenging for companies. Good news if you're a consultant, because you can help put all this together, but good news for consultants is not always good news for clients. Palantir, as I said, this kind of mysterious company that funded by Peter Thiel, the big Trump supporter, they only really have two major software offerings, and the thing that differentiates them is, I think, not the capabilities, it's the market. So there's Gotham, which is focused on the public sector, pretty widely used in the military, and Foundry, which is oriented to the private sector. Both of these are sort of broad platforms with a lot of different interconnected tools. They say they can go data to decisions all the way into operations. There was a big New York Times story in the Sunday magazine about Mr. Karp, the CEO of Palantir, but it didn't go into great detail about what Palantir actually does. There is now a third platform that sort of helps you if you don't want the whole thing. It helps you sort of pick and choose. That's called Apollo. It includes AI-driven integration. They do data cleansing, harmonizing of data. They have a group of people they call deltas, which contributes to this mysterious intelligence military sort of thing, that do forward deployed software engineering. So that's all these services people come into play. I've interviewed now 4 or 5 companies that have used Palantir. Most of them are pretty positive about it, frankly. It is being used in some interesting circumstances, like Airbus has a joint venture with Palantir to manage the data across all of its customers who fly Airbus airplanes, called Skywise, and Palantir pulls all the data together for them. Some other companies have JVs with Palantir to do that as well. One I've worked with some in Japan. However, generally, you've talked to the people in the companies who are not beholden to Palantir will say, we still have to do a lot to figure out how to analyze this data. But yes, they did a good job of pulling it together. Talking to some vendors about this, some of the comments that came up are, AI is not yet trusted and buyers are still skeptical of it. They want explainability. That was the focus, I think, of the panel that Andy Palmer ran yesterday, or at least one of the topics that came up. Most organizations have, it's like other kinds of software, if there's these narrow vendors, they have several vendors of catalogs, so rationalizing the vendor portfolio is a bit of a problem. One said, there's a startup every day in this space, and the tools are ridiculously narrow, and the customers are just confused, dabbling with a lot of little things and pieces. So this phrase, small pieces loosely joined, was a book title about the internet at one point. I thought it was appropriate here. What I, and to a somewhat lesser degree, Tom Redman, have concluded about this. AI is pretty much inevitable for small, structured, repetitive data management tasks. Good news overall for data management. If you're a low-level database administrator or something like that, maybe bad news, because that was how you made your living. If you were a master data management rule generator, bad news. I think there will be a lot of shakeout in this space among small vendors. I heard last night that Deloitte is saying, we'll help you assemble all of these pieces and maybe even charge you by the golden data records. $1 for every perfect customer record we'll charge you, charging for outcome rather than all these little pieces. I think at this point it's important to think about what you want to use AI for, what we still need humans for, and if you don't want to be on the cutting edge of pulling all these small pieces together, you better have a big checkbook because if you're going to go to Palantir, it's very expensive. If you're going to go to, I'm talking about for a big company in the tens and maybe even hundreds of millions of dollars to pull this together. So it's up to you. With that, I will shut up on my pontificating and hope somebody has some comments or questions. Thank you for showing up in this godforsaken room over here, but not that bad. It's at least cool.
At least it's cool.
Coolest room,
yeah,
yes.
Exactly. I'm intrigued by this notion of rules versus not rules. So both yourself and Michael Stonebreaker use that as a way to differentiate old and new. Are rules not sitting at the heart of the algorithms used by AI and ML? Is there a better way to differentiate old from new by focusing so much on rules?
Well, I think AI and ML are not, the machine, I call it all AI, frankly. Right. I think rules are still quite useful in some circumstances. And by the way, some of the survey research I've done with Deloitte suggests that over 50% of companies have some rule engine in place. And that's not even counting robotic process automation, which really runs on rule engines. So I think there's a lot to be said for them. There's a company near here in Kendall Square. By the way, are you impressed by all the construction here? It's unbelievable. This is the epicenter of pharmaceutical research these days. But one of them is a company called Foundation Health, now owned by Roche, I think. And they do Foundation Medicine. And they do sequencing of genomes, and they match it with cancer treatment options, clinical trials, and drugs. And they say, eventually we want to get to machine learning because it's a complex area. And if we have enough data to train models on, not based on rules, it's based on, fitting models to data, just like a regression equation. It's minimizing errors between lines and curves and data points. Then we want to use machine learning. But now we only have thousands of data points, not millions, and rules work pretty well. So I think rules tend to top out at a certain level of complexity, and that's always been the case. I worked with a AI startup in the 80s here in Kendall Square for financial planning. And there are two problems. One, the rules start conflicting if you get more than 1,000 or so, and it's hard to know how they interact with each other. And two, in financial planning, if the IRS changes the tax code, you have to go through and look at every rule. It's just very time consuming. So I think rules have a place, and they're great in terms of transparency and explainability, but I think they are fundamentally different from machine learning.
You've got a question on the internet. There's actually a bunch of them. We won't get to all of them for sure, but which one of your books would you rather have us read?
Well, I'd rather have you read the new ones. So I'll tell you about the new ones. There's one coming out, two coming out in the fall, one from Harvard Business Review Press called All In on AI with the head of AI at Deloitte. And that's companies that are really aggressive in their use of AI. kind of like competing on analytics, but about AI. And then there's another one with a professor in Singapore called Working with AI. That's MIT Press. People who work with AI on a day-to-day basis, and what does that mean for work as we know it? We call it the future of work now, in a sense.
Thomas, this is Pramod Singh. I'm a chief analytics officer for a financial tech company called Yodlee. And fascinating.
Yeah, I was a user of that for a while. Good aggregator. Yeah.
Good. So I think I can relate to what you're saying here. In fact, I'm giving a talk at 11:30 and talking about taking the financial transaction data, the description, and extracting entities out of it, right? So it gets a massively big problem, right? That there are millions of merchants, and there are different entities you can do. And I think we talked about the rules here, right? You get the instant gratification, and when the problem is somewhat easier, you can have the rules, right? But if you have millions of, we have more than 90 million transactions coming in every day. We have billions of transactions that we have to process and get these entities. Then the rules becomes brittle very quickly, right? If you make a rule and you say OM is OM, then Tom also becomes an OM, right? And then it keeps going like that, and you get those issues, right? So I think I'll talk about that in the talk at 11:30. But exactly what you said, how do you take transaction description, which is a very cryptic kind of a data, and extract entities like geolocations, the merchant, and the category out of it, right? So very, very relevant to how taking AI and making it real, right?
Yeah, not the most exciting application of AI, but perhaps the most useful that we have right now.
Exactly, because
overall.
once you have the base done correctly, there are tons of other applications that you can build on top of that.
Yeah. And then maybe we'll move to a world where we don't put data in these crazy formats to begin with,
right.
or that would require international cooperation. I work with a little mortgage company in the Boston area. Do you know how many different ways that banks report your bank balance every month? I mean, there are hundreds of them. So if you're trying to make sense of that to see whether somebody can afford a mortgage, really complicated. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks.
Again, we're getting short on time here. We'll try to squeeze in a couple more of these, and can take the top one from here.
Thank you so much. First of all, thank you for sharing. This was really good learning. So about a year ago, we realized in our business environment that deterministic rules are not enough to help us understand our data and manage the data. So we started to apply AI for that. So this looks very familiar to me. However, what we learned within the last year is that we had to keep the human in the loop. So even if AI identifies anomalies in real time, we still needed a data governance team to investigate the anomalies. We still needed the business to confirm that, give us feedback on the anomalies so the algorithm could learn and get better with time. That created a long queue for these other teams, the business teams, because they weren't staffed to support initially this kind of work. I'm wondering if you saw this happening in other industries and what solutions were provided to solve for this problem.
Well, it's interesting. You should ask some of the people at Tamer if they've come across this issue. But theoretically, I think business people have always been relatively uninterested in data governance. I think it's fair to say that's always been the big challenge for data governance. And so if this is going to give them more work, they're going to be bothered by it. But it's conceivable that ultimately it could produce less work. Because if you say to a subject matter expert, I'm not going to send you everybody, I'm only going to send you the ones that we can't make any sense of. And then maybe they'd say, okay, I can deal with that. That is the hope, I think. Yeah, over time. At the beginning, there's a lot, a lot of false positives or whatever, We're
going to try and squeeze the most upvoted question, but it's a little bit long. Data quality is an organization's issue. The quality of value creation using AI and analytics is directly proportional to the quality of data used. Data quality by design, culture in organization is critical, and it's a journey. What approaches should be used to drive this culture, which is a people issue?
Yeah, I wish Tom Redmond could be here, but his argument is data quality is a management issue. And the reason we have so many data quality problems is most managers don't really care about data quality. They don't incent it, they don't control it, they don't measure it, et cetera. So I think the only way we will change that culture, true of many cultural changes, is to engage managers in the idea that data is a really important asset to our business, and if it's really low quality, it's not much of an asset. So maybe it's a cliched answer, but it's the only one I got.
There are 230 people out there. There's a bunch more questions. We can't do them all now, but Tom, thank you so much for
Thank you. Enjoyed it.
Great talk.
Thanks a lot.